Mr. President,
I recognize the senator from Colorado.
I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we like to believe that when democracy erodes, that it's unpredictable and in some ways out of our control. But history tells us a different story. Authoritarianism rises through a time-tested playbook. These leaders have learned which moves weaken opponents, which tactics will rally a crowd, and which moments of fear or crisis work best to their advantage. They don't need to invent new strategies. They can run familiar plays. There's one target we're watching this administration go after the hardest, and that is the truth. They begin by attacking every source of independent information. They start with universities and colleges. They move on to our largest research institutions. They've discredited or tried to discredit every journalist whose reporting differs from their own narrow point of view. In doing so, they've tried to make the administration and the president the sole source of truth. We've seen this play out in Minneapolis during the past few weeks. So let's get a few facts straight. On January 7th, ICE officers shot and killed Renee Good while she was in her own car. She was a mother of three, originally from Colorado Springs. Then again, this past weekend, Americans watched the videotape of federal immigration agents shooting and killing Alex Preddy. They fired 10 times in 5 seconds. It's sickening. No family should have to witness their loved one being killed in such a fashion, and yet, obviously, Alex's parents did. His parents live in Colorado. I connected with them earlier this week. Among other things, they wanted to make sure that we do everything we can to make sure that Alex's name is out front, that we keep their son's story alive, to make sure that his life wasn't lost in vain. They've asked for truth and accountability. And what they're getting, what all of us are getting, are excuses and lies about their son. The reality of who Alex Preddy was doesn't fit the administration's playbook. So they're filling the airwaves with lies, repeating them over and over and over to try and somehow get them to stick. DHS Secretary Noem, within hours of Preddy's death, said, and I quote, "It looks like a situation where an individual arrived on the scene to inflict maximum violence and to kill law enforcement," end quote. Next, it was Greg Bovino, Trump's now-fired Border Patrol commander, saying Preddy intended, and I quote, "to massacre law enforcement," end quote, and that he, quote, "violently resisted." Stephen Miller called Alex Preddy a domestic terrorist, with Vice President Vance and President Trump promoting that sentiment and that blatant lie from their pulpits. By this point, we have all seen that video from multiple angles. We've seen it with our own eyes. Alex was not a terrorist. He was in no way an assassin. He was a U.S. citizen exercising his First Amendment right to protest ICE's lawlessness. This week, families in Eagle County, Colorado, experienced another type of cruelty that fits into this administration's playbook. They found death cards held up in the automobiles of their family members who were taken away by ICE agents. These cards, I hold one up here, have a history of being used by white supremacist groups to intimidate people of color. Death cards is what they call them. These cards found in Colorado had the address and the phone number of the Aurora ICE detention facility printed on them. Aurora is a sister city, a neighboring city to Denver. Now imagine just for a second that you haven't heard from your brother, your sister, and when you finally find their empty, abandoned car, it has one of these death cards sitting in the driver's seat. I mean, this is cruelty for the sake of cruelty. And it fits into the troubling pattern that we're seeing come from some of the top officials in the White House. Now, this morning I voted against government funding that would have handed billions of dollars to DHS. Continuing to fund ICE while federal officers terrorize our cities and kill people is unconscionable. We need to stop ICE officers beating Americans, killing Americans, arresting Americans without due process, taking away the civil rights of Americans. The overhaul of ICE that we're demanding is common sense. The fact is that these are all basic standards of local law enforcement who go after violent criminals, gangsters, in many ways the worst of the worst. These are standards that those local police officers already follow. ICE needs first to take their masks off. They need to turn on body cameras. They need to be clearly identified. There can be no accountability without transparency. No more unmarked vans and masked agents pulling people over and pulling people away and arresting them to wherever. No more roving patrols. ICE needs to have judicial warrants signed by a judge. They need to stop arresting children on the side of the road and end these cruel family separation policies. Secretary Noem, what she said, I think, is untenable and unacceptable, and I think she needs to resign. But let's be clear, ICE is carrying out the policies of our president. So just changing the leadership at ICE or DHS is not going to be sufficient. We have to fundamentally overhaul the lawlessness of these organizations. This administration is asking us to ignore what we can see with our own eyes. They get us to a point where we mistrust so many sources of information, and they force us to rely on believing what we see. They're asking us to believe lies about Alex and about Renee, about what's happening in Minneapolis, but we watched the videos. We saw those videos. Those words matter. We watched, we saw, because they acknowledge a larger truth that binds us all together. We saw what happens. We saw what happened. We saw the cruelty, and we saw and understand that it needs to end. Asking us to make peace with that cruelty is asking us to ignore the values that make us Americans. It's telling us to believe somehow we owe nothing to each other, not to our neighbors, not to our community, not to our country. We will not. We know the truth, and we're not going to look away. Thank you. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President,
Senator from Oklahoma.
this is Senate currently in a quorum call.
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this body disagrees on a lot of things. A lot. But we should have at least one thing we can agree on. It's pretty simple. Kids are different. You get 3 kids in a room, and all 3 of those kids are very, very different. I know I had 2 daughters, and they're different. Love them both deeply, but they're very different. And I find that in a lot of different families. Students and kids are different. Okay. One kid likes football, one kid likes baseball. Another kid doesn't like any sports at all. One likes the band, one likes choir, one likes drama. One doesn't like any clubs at all. One's in Latin club and another's in a chess club, and the other one thinks chess club is dorky. Okay? You know why? Because people are different. That seems very normal for us to be able to think about that most basic thing, that not everyone is the same and not everyone chooses the same things that they like or has the same needs. But sometimes when we get into school, we'll say, oh, no, but they all need to go to the same school. I just disagree. In America this week, this is actually School Choice Week. And some people may or may not even track that, and that's fine. There's a week designated for everything across the country. But in Oklahoma, we've really prioritized the ability for every family to be able to make their own choices for education for their kids. We have strong homeschooling. We have strong private schools. We have strong public charter schools. And we have public education. All of them are important to us. And all of them provide different options for families. Now, we've still got a long way to go in education in Oklahoma. We're investing more and more and more into education, and I'm proud of our state legislatures prioritizing in this coming session reading for early childhood education and to make sure that we're doing the things that we need to do to improve our public education. But in the meantime, we want to continue to provide options to every single family and to every single kid to be able to make sure that the best education environment is out there for that particular child. Because we want every child to be able to thrive in America. And we want every child to be able to have the opportunities that they need to be able to be successful in the days ahead. And that starts with a great education. Quite frankly, some of our districts are doing not as well as others. Some are doing great. Some are struggling. I don't want a single family in my state, though, to have to think my kids have to go to a certain school because of the zip code that I live in, and that's the only option. Quite frankly, I don't even want that for families to say every one of my kids has to go to the same school, because sometimes that just doesn't work the same. Now, I've heard some folks that are very passionate about public education, which, by the way, I am too. My mom was a lifelong public school educator. My degree was in secondary education. My family's very, very involved in education, and I'm very passionate about public education. I think it's vitally important that we do it, and we do it very, very well. But I want to make it very clear for all the folks that I meet that say, if you'll just give us a couple more years, this will improve. Give us a couple more dollars and a couple more semesters, and this will get better for this particular school. I want to remind them that the kid growing up next to that school doesn't have a couple more years. It has to be right now for them. They can't wait till things get better. They only have today. So that's why school choice is so incredibly important, that every family and that every kid has the options to be able to get a better education, or to get an education that exactly fits them best. That works better. This past July, we passed the Historic Working Families Tax Cut Act. And in that act, we did a lot of investment in education. We expanded the 529 savings accounts to allow more parents to be able to set aside funding for private education if they choose to do that, and put that in their 529 so it could grow tax-free. We invested more into Pell Grants and expanded the growth of Pell Grants. Now, you may say, why does that matter for K through 12? Well, Pell Grants have been really targeted towards institutions that do what's called terminal degrees. So if you're a kid in poverty and you want to get a degree in philosophy, we would help you do that. But if you're a kid in poverty and you want to get a certification in welding or in plumbing
or in carpentry or as a truck driver, we would say, you're on your own. Well, what in the world? For years, we've been fighting this to be able to say, if we're going to help somebody, give them more options than just a 4-year degree. If they want to do certification programs to be able to get into a vocation faster, why wouldn't we help them do that to be able to rise out of poverty? We fixed that in the Working Families Tax Cut Act to expand the use of Pell Grants so that more individuals that are in poverty can get access to education that helps them get to a job even faster. We actually reversed some changes that were done in the FAFSA, and I'm not even going into all the issues of the FAFSA and for getting into higher education, but it actually blocked out kids from agricultural families because of the land and the equipment that they own. They may be land rich, but they're often cash poor, but they were still blocked out of getting federal assistance, getting higher education. We finally fixed that. There's a lot of other areas we fixed, but we also set up a new program where individuals could actually give to school choice for other families that they'll probably never, ever meet, to be able to help them in the days ahead, be able to get an option for private education when they couldn't get there. I have folks that catch me on this occasionally and will say, you talk about school choice all the time and the different options on things. Do you just hate public education, or why is this such a big deal to you? And I smile at them and remind them of my mom and of my own past, that I'm very, very passionate about public education. And we need to make sure we're investing in doing that well. But if I have a quiet moment with folks when they say to me, why do you care so much about school choice? I'll tell them there's 2 reasons. One is my state cares about this a lot. Our homeschool programs, our programs for private education, we have thriving, great public charter schools, and we have a lot of great districts around. But many of our districts, even according to our state law, even in our public education in Oklahoma, you can choose from one district to another district, even if you don't live in that zip code for that district. So that you even get school choice in Oklahoma, even in public education. It's a big deal to us. But it's a big deal to me personally because I personally experienced it. You see, my mom, single mom, public educator, did not make much, had a time when I was in elementary school, and so was my brother, that education was not working for us. And so my single mom sacrificed everything for my brother and I to go to private school. Now, I went to private school for 2 years, and then she ran out of money. My brother continued on for a while, but I went back into public schools, which no complaint there. But I watched even in my own family and my mom say, I wish we had different options. And as a public school educator, single mom, she made the hard call to say, I've got to figure out a better place because my kids will only get one shot at education. And it's got to count. I could not tell you how grateful I am for my mom and the sacrifices that she made for my brother and I, because it made all the difference for us. But it's because she made a choice where you would have looked at her and said, she has no choice. She figured it out. And we all sacrificed a lot, but education was just that important to her. I don't want that to just be for my family. I want that option for every family. I want the option for every kid to have the opportunity to get the best possible education for who they are. Because my brother and I love him, but we could not be more different because we're 2 different kids, just like a lot of other families. So please don't say every kid has to do education exactly the same way when we all know every kid is different. So why don't we give families the option to choose what's the best education environment for that particular kid and to allow them to thrive in the days ahead. I think that's better for kids, to allow them to have the choice and for every family to get that choice as well. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Florida.
As you may know, Mr. President, we are recognizing National School Choice Week, and I thank my colleague for organizing those of us that believe dearly in educational options for children to come to the floor and speak about what we have accomplished and what we hope to accomplish on behalf of America's kids. As you may know, in addition to being a United States Senator, I am also a mom of a kid in school who's gone to many different kinds of schools over the course of his educational career. And I'm honored to serve as a co-host this week with the chairman of the Help Committee, Senator Cassidy, as well as my friend, Senator Tim Scott, to represent the long strides my home state of Florida has taken to make us the best state, I believe, in the nation for educational freedom. And this did not happen overnight. It took decades of thoughtful policy making and implementation, tweaks along the way, and we're still working to get it right. But I wanted to show up here today and tell my colleagues about how Florida has set its kids on paths to success by thinking outside the one-size-fits-all approach for education. And that happened from tireless work from parents, from advocates, and a state government that transformed Florida from a state with poor performance across the board to a leader nationwide in education. We went from having graduation rates at just 60%, with less than 1% of K-12 students attending a public charter school and fewer than 10 students in the state receiving a K-12 scholarship in 1999. Again, I'll say that again, 60% graduation rate. And in the decades that followed, today I am proud to say Florida now has a graduation rate of 92% of its kids graduating on time. And that coincides when we really started pushing educational options for our kids, beginning with Governor Bush, right up until our current governor, Ron DeSantis, who got to make this great announcement. We were one of the first states a few years ago to adopt universal school choice. Close to 1 in 8 of our students now attend a public charter school, And more than 450,000 students receive some form of K-12 scholarship, including the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship. For our children in Florida, school choice has been an invaluable tool for success, no matter their background or means or what zip code they live in. It is these accomplishments in Florida that drive me now as a United States Senator to ensure that all of America's kids can prosper. I have been a proud champion of the Education Freedom Tax Credit, which is now, I'm proud to say, signed into law. And not only do Florida kids have access to all of the options that we've provided to them through state law, they now have access to supplemental resources that was provided through the Education Freedom Tax Credit. And I thank my colleagues and I thank the President for supporting this measure. Now 2 million children across the nation will be able to seek the schooling that best fits their needs. And this is another way that we are empowering parents by supporting educational freedom across the country. And as we wrap up National School Choice Week, we must remember and keep advocating publicly, because there are some states that have the opportunity to opt in and will refuse to do so. And that breaks my heart for so many kids that could benefit from what's available to them through educational choice. We must continue to remind the rest of America about the success we've seen in states that embraced educational alternatives and saw what it means when you place an emphasis on individual school needs and student needs, not zip codes or economic means. Individual needs of students, individual circumstances of students should drive their opportunities for success. And the possibilities are endless. When we do away with that one-size-fits-all approach and empower parents to choose what best fits their individual child. And that is why I am committing to continuing to advocate for school choice so that all of America's kids see the same opportunities that we've been able to offer to the children of Florida. Thank you so much, Mr. President, and I yield back.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. Is the Senate in a quorum call?
We are not.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, for many months, the Trump administration has unleashed a campaign of fear across American cities, deploying thousands of immigration agents onto our streets and into our neighborhoods in an effort to terrorize and punish communities. In Chicago, Portland, Los Angeles, and most recently Minneapolis, we have watched mass federal agents in unmarked cars snatch people from the street, destroy private property, and leave others bloodied on the side of the road. We've witnessed an approach to internal immigration enforcement which no president in our history has pursued, that no president would ever have conceived, because of how fundamentally it violates our principles and the rule of law. We've witnessed children separated from their parents, a 5-year-old detained by armed agents in Minnesota, people pulled from their cars, their engines still running. All of us have read reports of people grabbed off the sidewalk and abandoned hours later, miles away. And every step along the way, Donald Trump's immigration troops have escalated tension on our streets, with total disregard for the rule of law, basic safety, and their own accountability. These events would be terrible enough, but even as communities across the country have struggled to pick up the pieces left in their wake, we've been forced to contend with another injustice, an administration that has tried to convince us time and time again that what we have seen with our own eyes is not the truth, that somehow the opposite has taken place, that reports and testimony contradicting the administration's position are simply political propaganda. Over and over again, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem and others in the administration have lied to the American people and to Congress about what we are all seeing in plain sight. And now they're lying to justify the murder of Alex Preddy. Right after the shooting of Alex Preddy in the street, Noem went on national television and told us that Alex was brandishing a firearm, quote, impeding the law enforcement officers and attacking them, and that he, quote, acted violently or reacted violently when officers attempted to disarm him. She insisted that, quote, an agent fired defensive shots, and that it appeared that this was, quote, a situation where an individual arrived at the scene to inflict maximum damage on individuals and kill law enforcement. Stephen Miller, who works at the White House, called Alex a, quote, domestic terrorist and a, quote, would-be assassin. Vice President J.D. Vance amplified these statements. Gregory Bovino, a senior Border Patrol official who is serving, quote, as commander-at-large, maintained that Alex had intended to, quote, massacre law enforcement agents. At a press conference, Bonino turned the facts completely upside down, insisting that the victims of Saturday's violence were the Border Patrol agents that were there. Bovino, by the way, has served as the face of the administration's operations as they have swept through America's cities. In Chicago, and Charlotte, and New Orleans, and then Minneapolis. The American people deserve to know the truth. And Alex Preddy and his family deserve to have the truth told about him and what he did. Thanks to a number of courageous bystanders at the scene, we know what happened that day. And we know that everything that Noem and Miller and others have said have been lies. The truth is that Alex put himself between federal agents and a woman they were shoving in the street. He had been filming Border Patrol agents detaining someone else on the side of the road when he went to help this woman. The officers responded by pepper spraying him and wrestling him to the ground, where he was quickly surrounded by a group of 7 agents. They struck him repeatedly with the pepper spray canister while he lay in the street. One officer took away his gun, a gun that had remained holstered and that Alex was legally allowed to carry. Then disarmed and incapacitated, they shot him in his back. They shot him at least 10 times within 5 seconds. Alex Preddy was killed by his own government. And then his government immediately began to lie about him and what had happened. He did not attack the agents. He did not threaten them, and at no point did he pull a gun. In the video of that horrific scene, it's clear that an agent disarmed him before any shots were fired. Multiple agents held him to the ground. 3 of them beat him. No reasonable person would have believed he posed any threat to the agents or anyone else at the scene. But the agents still shot him. They shot him 10 times. In the days since his murder, we've learned a lot more about Alex from those who knew him and loved him. Alex was a dedicated ICU nurse at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Minneapolis. His colleagues described him there as helpful and kind, and that he was uniquely capable of handling things with integrity and with grace. His high school classmates remember him as a role model. They recalled him being a really good friend and a really good man. Alex loved his country, and like many of us, he was deeply concerned about the Trump administration's actions and the devastating effect they are having on our democracy. It is true that he had very strong feelings about the presence of ICE on his city's streets. But the day he was killed, Alex was exercising his First Amendment rights to peacefully protest and document the actions of federal agents as they threatened his community. Alex's parents, Michael and Susan, live in Colorado. They want the world to know the truth about what happened that day and the truth about the kind of son, the kind of person their son really was. They told the world that Alex wanted to make a difference in the world. His patients and colleagues, friends and family testified to the fact that he did. And it is another tragedy that he will no longer be able to continue to do so. But Alex's murder is only the most recent outrage we've been subjected to by a reckless and out-of-control DHS. On January 7th, federal agents shot and killed Renee Good in Minneapolis. Renee was a mother of 3 and a native of Colorado Springs. The next day, federal agents shot and wounded 2 people in Portland. A week later, federal agents shot and wounded another man again in Minneapolis. It's worth remembering that these are just a few of the instances that have occurred in broad daylight and in public spaces where bystanders have been there, Mr. President, to witness these brutal activities firsthand and managed to capture video of what happened. But if this is what's happening out in the open, it's hard to imagine what is happening behind closed doors. Last year, 32 people died in ICE custody. That's the most in over 20 years, Mr. President. Given the total lack of transparency and accountability that we've seen from ICE, we can't be sure what's happened to these people. There have been reports about sexual abuse of detainees. There are disputed facts over deaths that occurred in ICE custody. People in ICE facilities have reportedly been forced to ration food. They often go days or weeks without their prescription medicines, Mr. President, or access to medical care. Overcrowded detention facilities leave the lights on 24/7. And families report extreme violence and intimidation by guards. These stories are consistent from people held in detention across the country, including in the detention facility in Aurora, Colorado. But the administration has lied about all of it. President Trump has claimed that Renee Good was a, quote, professional agitator, that she was very disorderly, obstructing and resisting, then violently and willfully and viciously ran over the ICE officer. Noam described Good's efforts to leave the scene peacefully as an act of domestic terrorism. Her department issued a statement saying that, quote, a violent rioter had weaponized her vehicle. In October, Noam and her department lied when she said no U.S. citizens had been arrested, detained, or deported. In November, federal judge Sarah Ellis described Gregory Bovino as evasive, not credible, and declared that he was, quote, outright lying when questioned under oath. A consistent pattern of lies corrodes Americans' faith in our government, which is already stretched dangerously thin. It strikes at the core of our constitutional system, which requires at least some basic level, some basic fidelity to facts in the conduct of our public affairs and our public discourse. When the Secretary of Homeland Security appears on television to insist repeatedly on her preferred version of events, she's not just offering another lie that must be rebutted. She's insisting that there could never be a truth that actually mattered to the American people or to our sense of public safety or to our exercise in self-government. And that is what's at stake here, Mr. President. If we allow this to continue, we risk falling into a degraded version of political debate when there are so many lies and so many contested facts that the American people regard any claim with exhausted cynicism and suspicion. And if we go too far down that path, and we're headed a long way down it right now, the only guaranteed outcome will be greater contempt felt by Americans for their government and for the political process. They will withdraw from public life and the possibility for genuine political disagreement. In other words, a debate over what to do in the face of facts, rather than over the facts themselves. We're unwilling to even have a discussion about it because of our permanent partisan division will be erased. Every one of us has a responsibility at a moment like this. And we know from American history that in some ways, the most significant resistance in moments like this comes from the public itself. It comes from the people of this country. I could see that on the steps and the grounds of the state capitol in Colorado last weekend when thousands of Coloradans were there to rally not just for themselves, but for their fellow citizens in Minnesota and across our country. I think when times are tough, we often have a tendency to think that we're living in uniquely bad times. But I believe that way of thinking almost always does a disservice to the people who have come before us, who took on even tougher battles with longer odds, and who, while they were doing that, and because they were doing that, bequeathed to us their own legacy of resistance and the possibility of change, no matter how hard it seemed. And I think we should look to those battles for inspiration in our time. Yet it's important for us to tell our kids about those battles, to make sure they understood what those fights actually looked like, and how hopeless at times those fights seemed to the people that were waging them. When I was growing up, and I know this is true for many of my colleagues who are here, the moral character of this country was defined by the civil rights movement, the struggle against segregation and the fight for equality. This fight, this battle, the effort to demolish centuries of legalized discrimination and disenfranchisement never was going to be easy, and many believed that it was nearly impossible. And there were others who believed that it shouldn't have been fought to begin with. And I would say to this day, we have a long, long way to go. The structure of Jim Crow, of the poll tax, of separate and worse schoolrooms and hospital wards and lunch counters had been built up over generations. State laws had established these exclusionary practices. State officials enforced them and state courts upheld them. There was no guarantee that they would ever come crashing down. But they did, because the leaders of the civil rights movement and ordinary citizens in the streets and in America's pulpits, and reporters, journalists sent to report on the demonstrations and the conditions of real life in the South of this country, made it impossible to ignore the facts. It was harder then than it is in our own time just to turn the channel and imagine that alternate reality didn't actually exist. People in that country, with the broadcasters, ABC and CBS and NBC, it was impossible for the public to ignore what was right before their eyes. The success of that generation of brave Americans was achieved because they forced a broad swath of this country, a majority of this country, to finally see what they would have been preferred to be blind to: the reality of segregation and the subordination of their fellow citizens under law. It is a story of moral reckoning and of citizen action. It is a story of street protests and police brutality and political vacillation, but it's also a story of American renewal, of our ability to author our own history, to continue the endless founding and refounding of this country as generations of Americans lay claim to it and shape it. I don't believe that we've lost that ability. I don't believe that we've lost that ambition. I don't believe that people in Colorado and Minnesota and all across this country have given up on the promise offered by America, a promise that can only be given and kept to each other. As Alex Preddy said himself when honoring a veteran who died in his care, today we remember that freedom is not free. We have to work at it, nurture it, protect it, and even sacrifice for it. In the end, it's also not enough for there to be just public expressions or disapproval. We actually have to change the laws. Part of our job here as senators is to uphold the ideals that Alex and so many others in Minnesota and across Colorado and across the country believe in and are fighting for. And it's our job here in the Senate to provide a check on an executive who our founders knew was always susceptible to the temptations of unlimited power. That was their concern about a unitary executive, the President of the United States. And this week we have an opportunity to be that check. We have an opportunity to change the law. The Senate, Mr. President, is considering a number of bills to fund the government, including one that provides over $10 billion to the very department that's responsible for the murder of Alex Preddy and the chaos we are seeing in communities across the country. It would be unconscionable for us to pass this bill without amending how ICE or the Border Patrol operate at all. In fact, we should use this as an opportunity to do it. What better opportunity will there be? It's written, the Homeland Appropriations Bill provides no real accountability, no oversight, no guardrails or transparency. It offers no guarantee at all that what happened to Alex Preddy won't happen again. And that's all the more absurd, Mr. President, because Republicans gave the Department of Homeland Security an additional $190 billion on top of the regular annual appropriations. Think about that. $190 billion additional dollars on top of the annual appropriations last year as part of their big, beautiful bill that they passed on a partisan vote. And this funding, I can assure you, came with no accountability or oversight at all. In the midst of all this, it would be a profound abdication of our responsibility as senators to entertain the idea of providing more funding to the department unless serious reforms are put in place. And I think that these reforms are common sense that you'd want for any law enforcement agency operating in America. But especially when it comes to a federal agency operating in some sense now as the president's internal army. I think the least we could ask is that children are no longer detained or stripped from their families. Who wants to come to this floor and say and debate the opposite of that point? Immigration officers should take off their masks and provide clear identification. There is no doubt in my mind that the minute we get through this fraught political moment in America, there will be a broad consensus. In fact, I think there is one now, that ICE shouldn't be separating children from their families, that law enforcement agents shouldn't be wearing masks, that they should use body cameras consistently with any immigration enforcement activities, and that ICE stays away from sensitive areas like schools and hospitals and places of worship. And, consistent with our responsibility, our duty to provide a check, to provide our own oversight, that members of Congress have full access to immigration detention facilities. Those are reforms that do not today define the way ICE does its work. They do define the way a lot of our local law enforcement does its work. But I think they reflect a massive consensus in the country about what would fix the challenges that we're facing. It would at least be a basic start in the right direction. In my view, he might disagree, but in my view, President Trump would be doing himself and the country a favor if he removed Kristi Noem from her position and prevented her from doing any more harm to this country and to our communities. And if he removed DHS agents from Minnesota and other cities across our country. And I would say to all of my colleagues here, Republicans and Democrats, that we cannot simply accept a promise of change or action or reform from this administration, which has spent months lying to Congress and the American people with a straight face. There is no world where we can sit back and assume that the president and his team are going to be persuaded to do anything, unless we write it into law. And even then, we have no guarantee, of course, that this administration won't just break the law as soon as it's written. That's been our experience in Colorado, Mr. President. But at least putting this into statute would be a better pathway for holding Noem and Miller and others accountable for the bloodshed and chaos that we're seeing in our streets. After that, I think we could have serious conversations about passing a funding bill. Until then, we can't allow this legislation to go forward. Our children and future generations have a reasonable expectation that their elected officials will do everything in their power to keep them safe and to provide the plain facts as they are. As legislators, it's our responsibility to stand up to an executive branch that is unleashing mayhem in our streets and gunning down American citizens, while insisting that the public should not believe what they have seen and what they have heard, or that it's unpatriotic all of a sudden to disagree with the president's version of events. We've seen this story before. There is nothing new under the sun. We know the dark path this can lead us down. But we've also seen the courage that is demonstrated by the generations of Americans that have come before us that have disagreed in this chamber, that have disagreed with each other, but who ultimately have rejected injustice, and particularly when it was directed from the highest levels of government. One of these people was a hero of mine. It won't surprise anybody here to know that it was Colorado's former governor, Ralph Carr, who spoke out against Japanese internment when most politicians in the West and in this country were staying silent. Addressing a crowd one day on the eastern plains of Colorado, Governor Carr said, quote, "I am talking to all American people, whether their status be white, brown, or black, when I say that if a majority may deprive a minority of its freedom, contrary to the terms of the Constitution today, then you as a minority may be subjected to the same ill will of the majority tomorrow." What happened to Alex Prudy and the lies that followed was an assault on every one of us, on all of our children, on our sense of dignity and our innate understanding of right and wrong. Now is the time for my colleagues to come together and demand that we reassert these principles and demand the return of safety and security and sanity to our government, rather than the chaos and destruction that we have recently seen. It's what all Americans expect, Mr. President, and it is what our country deserves. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.